Hey guys, this is Mr. Moore, and these are the notes for week 5 of the government class. The notes this week are going to be fundamental principles of civil society. We like to think that we live in a civil society, and when things are running smoothly, when the economy is functioning properly, when people have jobs and people are entertained, things run pretty smoothly. But when there are loss of jobs and the economy starts to collapse and there are social issues, people get out and protest. Sometimes those protests turn violent, and sometimes it seems like we don't live in a civil society. But we're going to talk about are some basics of our government, things I think every single American should know. And I put this essential question down, and I do one each week, and I hope you include it in your notes, because I want you to kind of consider which direction we're heading and why we're taking these notes. We're taking these notes so that we can be functioning members of society. By the time you graduate from high school, you have to know how society works, your place in it. And if we truly want to live in a democratic system, we have to have people that are educated. That's one of the deep concerns that people have. If we lived in a totalitarian dictatorship, or if we lived in a kingdom or an empire where there was a king or an emperor, it wouldn't matter if we were educated because all you have to do is just follow the rules. But if you live in a democracy, in fact, in the United States, we live in a republic, but we use the principles of democracy. And as such, we have to have citizens that are educated and know how the government is supposed to work. And if it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, we need to get involved. So that's the essential question. How should the government work versus how does it work in the real world? The truth is, during the first quarter, I spend a lot more time talking about how it should work, like laying out the 3 branches of government, okay, and the different rules of those 3 branches. And then during the second quarter of this one semester class, I generally spend a lot more time talking about how it really does work in the real world and what are the factors that actually put pressure on our government. And so keep those things in mind as we go through these notes, okay? A couple weeks ago, I went over some things that every American should know, and I've entitled this slide, A Few More Things That Every American Should Know. And again, if I ever have the chance to make a pun with my name, I certainly will take advantage of that. So one of the things I think that every American should know, and I'm assuming you do know, but I don't want to take anything for granted. I want to put it out there that the first president of the United States was George Washington. Interestingly enough, our country existed for just a bit over 10 years before we had a president. When our country was first formed, we functioned under what we called the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, there was no president. So it wasn't until a little bit more than 10 years after the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution was over, finally George Washington became president. Some people think he went from being the commander of the Continental Army straight into the job of being president. And that's not true. After the war, he went home to Virginia, back to his home there, and went back to farming. He was a huge distiller of alcohol and had tobacco plantations. And of course, a lot of people know that even George Washington had slaves. But that's our first president. In some of our notes, I've gone over multiple presidents. Right now in 2020, Donald Trump is the president, and he is the 45th president. Okay? Who was president during the Civil War? The 16th president of the United States, you can jot that down in your notes, the 16th president of the United States was Abraham Lincoln, probably one of the most hated presidents in the history of the United States. So hated, in fact, that 7 southern states seceded, right, and started the Civil War, and eventually other states joined, okay? And during the Civil War, those states that seceded ended up electing their own president of the Confederate States of America, and Jefferson Davis was his name. So Abraham Lincoln was so hated the southern states seceded from the Union. And in fact, just a couple of days after the Civil War was over, a Southerner assassinated Abraham Lincoln. He was the first president to be shot and killed in office just a few days after the Civil War. Today, we think of Abraham Lincoln as a hero and maybe as one of the most loved presidents of all times. But you have to remember that in its context. So whether you like the president right now or you hate the president right now, we don't know how history is going to treat the current president. Okay? So who was the current president during the Civil War? Abraham Lincoln, and he was the 16th president of the United States. When was the Civil War? The Civil War is one of the most crucial pieces of American history. Our country started in 1776, on July 4th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And that, of course, launched what we call the American Revolution. Almost 100 years later, in the 1860s, is when the Civil War happened. So almost 100 years after the Declaration of Independence is when Abraham Lincoln was becoming president of the United States. Not quite 100 years, okay, 1860s, 61 to 65. But that's when the U.S. Civil War was, okay, the 1860s. Now, interestingly enough, in the Civil War, of course, we ended up ending slavery and trying to emancipate African Americans who had been in forced slavery. But even 100 years after the Civil War, in the 1960s, we're still fighting for civil rights. In fact, if you've been paying attention to what's happening in 2020, maybe we're still dealing with civil rights. And so going back to the Civil War, even though it's over 100 years ago, we're still dealing with some of the ramifications of those social issues in our country. One of the most famous monuments in the United States, and you can go Google this later on, but there are 4 presidents who had their faces carved in stone, okay, at Mount Rushmore. And so some people would consider these guys the 4 most important presidents. Now, obviously, that's an opinion and not a fact. I can tell you a fact who the 4 presidents are, but it's not a fact that they're the best or the most important. But generally considering that they're the only ones that had their faces carved in stone, it's a pretty, good opinion to have. So the 4 presidents whose faces are carved in Mount Rushmore, of course, is our first president, George Washington, and our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, that we just talked about. The 2 other presidents that have their faces carved in stone on Mount Rushmore in the Dakotas would be Thomas Jefferson. He was our 3rd president. He's the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence way before he was president, obviously. That was when our country was first starting. And the 4th president is the 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. Those are the 4 presidents that have their faces carved in Mount Rushmore. So what I'm trying to do is get you to know some basic things that every American should know. And on the midterm, I'm going to ask some of these questions. So hopefully you're taking good notes and paying attention. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt, the 4 presidents who have their faces carved in stone on Mount Rushmore in the Dakotas, in the central part of our country. Now, over the last couple of weeks, as we've been getting into this government class, I have been lecturing on the 3 branches of government. I'm going to spend a lot more time in a later week's notes talking about the judicial branch, but I have already lectured extensively on the legislative branch, which is Congress. Congress has 2 parts, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Okay. I also lectured extensively on the executive branch. And in our country, the executive branch is called the president and the vice president, and they get to pick a cabinet to work and run the departments of the executive branch, right? The Secretary of State and the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of Defense and such as that. Okay. 15 pieces or secretaries or departments within that presidential cabinet. So there's quite a bit about the president and his powers that we've already lectured on. And of course, we're going to talk about the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, or in fact, the entire federal court system. Okay, but that's going to be coming up in a couple of weeks. But you need to know what those three basic branches are. The legislative branch makes the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch is judicial review, like to review the law, making sure it's constitutional, if you will. Okay? What do we call each branch of government in our country? Great. I'm going to recap it one more time. The legislative branch is Congress. The executive branch is the president. And the judicial branch is the Supreme Court, or the entire federal court system. Okay? What does each branch of government do? I will repeat again because this is the major part of our test, right? The legislative branch, Congress, makes the laws. The executive branch, the president, enforces the laws, executes them, right? And the judicial branch reviews the laws to make sure it's constitutional. That's the Supreme Court. So again, I've just said that like 3 or 4 times. I hope it's down in your notes, but more importantly, in your brains. Again, I've mentioned this several times in class. One semester we focus on government. The other semester we focus on economics. But if you know anything about government and economics, you know that the two do overlap. The government does get involved in the economy, and the economy does affect who gets elected and how our government functions. So we are going to touch on some economic terminology in this first semester, just like we'll have to deal with some governmental aspects in the second semester when we're focusing on economics. The economic system of the United States is capitalism. I'll repeat that again. It's capitalism. Capitalism is a system where there is competition. Capitalism is a free market. Capitalism is where people invest money in businesses and get a return on their investment, and that return is called capital, literally, extra money that you have. If you have extra money that you can invest, that's capital, okay? And so that's what we're talking about right there, okay? Capitalism. We'll go into some more depths, the free market society, the laissez-faire, that's like hands off. Technically, some people feel like the government shouldn't get involved in the economy, but some people feel like it should get more involved. What are some of the other economic systems that exist in the world? Well, communism is another economic system that we do not use. Socialism is a step down from communism, where people have things in commonality, and kind of looking out for the greater good instead of your own individual interests. That's one of the problems with capitalism, is the greed, because people are just looking out for their own self-interest and not the collective good. That would be more socialism, where you're looking out for society as a whole, not just your own self-interests. And so people see things different ways, but that's the general rule of thumb, is the economic system of the United States is capitalism. Okay. We talked about this just a minute ago. What do we call each branch of our government? Well, the legislative branch is called Congress. But Congress has 2 parts. One is called the Senate, and the other is called the House of Representatives. Okay, the Senate has 2 senators from every state, no matter how big the state is, no matter the size of the state or population or anything. Every state gets 2. On a test, if I ask you how many senators from Rhode Island, 2. How many senators from North Dakota, 2. How many senators from Texas, 2. 2, 2, 2. That's how many senators. So if we have 50 states in 2020, that means we have 100 senators. Okay? Senators serve for 6 years when they're elected in, but they can run as often as they want. You have to be at least 30 years old and reside in the state in which you run. Okay? The other side is called the House of Representatives, and the number of representatives that a state gets is based on the state's population. So how many representatives does Montana get? It depends on the population of Montana. but every state gets at least one. Now, the only state I require that you know is California, and you have to know that California has 53 in the House of Representatives and 2 in the Senate. So we have a total of 55 in Congress. Okay? If you don't understand that, you need to pause it, rewind it, listen. That's one of the beauties of having this recorded on YouTube, as you're going over the notes. You can pause, rewind if you didn't catch something, but these are really the answers to the test and answers to what's going on in the real world, okay? How long does a president serve? Well, senators serve for 6 years. Representatives in the House of Representatives serve for 2 years. And in between that is the president, who gets 4 years. So if a president is elected, they can serve for 4 years, and then they can run for office again. And if they get voted in a second time, I guess they potentially could have a total of 8 years. According to an amendment to the Constitution, presidents can now only serve twice. That wasn't a rule when our country first started. Our first president, George Washington, kind of set an example or a precedence by only serving 2 terms, and every president since George Washington has followed that rule until FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He actually was serving his 4th term when he died in office. He's the only one who broke that rule, FDR. The 32nd president of the United States. And after that, we actually put it into an amendment to the Constitution so nobody else could ever be a president more than twice. Okay? How many continents are there in the world? We spent time in class, and there will be questions on the test so that you know where all of the continents are. Remember, we're only going to do 6 of the continents: North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. We're not going to deal with Antarctica because nobody lives there, right? There's a bunch of penguins and some marine life and some researchers who freeze their butt off down there, but there's no countries and there's no cities, right? So we're not going to deal with Antarctica, but the other 6 continents, you need to know where they are, and you need to know the 4 oceans. We went over that in class and even gave you a study guide just to make sure you're a good citizen of the world and you know where places are when you watch the news and when we have discussions here in class, okay? What are the dangers of majority rule? If we take just a standard vote and we say, hey, look, who wants this, item A, and who wants item B, and we can only choose one, we take a vote and say 55% of the people choose item A and we get item A. That means that 45% of the people didn't get what they want. And so when you have a democracy, where you have the principles of democracy, even in a system like ours where we're a republic and we're choosing representatives, people won't always be happy. In fact, there's never really been a time in our country where everybody's loved the president, maybe for a couple of months after we win a war or something like that. But if you ever feel like, man, there's a lot of political confrontation, it's because if you have voting and you let people choose, certain people are not going to win. And so they're going to have to deal with what the rest of the population chose. And that does cause confrontation, and it does cause issues in our country, and it's something we have to be aware of when it comes to politics, okay? That's one of the main issues that people have. One reason why some people like politics, and some reason why people don't, okay? Let's hit some of the important jobs this week. I'm going to have there's some videos at the end of these notes on bureaucracies and what is a bureaucrat or what is a bureaucracy. And those are professional government workers. These are the people who are not voted in. They're people who live in Washington, D.C., and they work at the White House, and they have worked at the White House for like 20 years or more. And they've worked with lots of different presidents. There's people who will work their entire life, 30, 40 years until they retire, and they might go through like 4 or more presidents. These are the people who are actually running the departments actually full-time professional governmental workers. They're not the ones that are politicians. So we call them bureaucrats. These are professional government workers, office or department that is not subject to elections. So if a president gets elected, okay, so let's say a president gets elected, he does get to pick advisors and he does get to pick some office staff. But there are other people who are just working in departments that it doesn't matter who the president is, they're going to keep working there. And that's really the simplest definition of what a bureaucrat is, or what a bureaucracy is, okay? The president has the power to pick official representatives of the United States. Because the president is one person and there's close to 200 countries on the planet Earth, obviously the president can't be meeting with everybody. That's so many different countries to deal with. So the president picks an ambassador from the United States to represent us to another country. An official representative of the government, usually sent to a foreign country to negotiate diplomatic agreements and arrangements. Depending on what country you're sent to, kind of depends on your power. If you're the ambassador from the United States to China, that's one of the most important jobs in government because China's one of the strongest economies and the biggest population on the planet Earth. So if you're the U.S. ambassador to China, that's huge power. If you're the U.S. ambassador to Bhutan, some of you guys don't even know that's a country on the planet Earth. Or if you're the U.S. ambassador to Djibouti, there's seriously a country in Africa called Djibouti. Then you're still an ambassador, but you're just to the little country of Djibouti. And so I can't help but almost giggle every time I say Djibouti. It's a little tiny country right on the Horn of Africa, right next to the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula. Anyways, if you're an ambassador from the United States to somewhere like that, you're not going to have a lot of power in government. But if you're the U.S. ambassador to France, well, that's huge, right? Because France is in the top 10 economies of the world, okay? Usually ambassadors work and live at an embassy. The official residence or office of an ambassador, okay, that's what an embassy is. So say you're traveling in France. If you ever have any issues in France, like legal issues, you could go to the U.S. Embassy and say, I'm an American citizen. It's like having a little slice of our country in a foreign nation, if that makes sense. And most countries have embassies. So inside the United States, we have like a Chinese embassy and a Japanese embassy and a French embassy and an embassy from Argentina. And again, we also have the opposite in their country. When I was walking around the streets of Tokyo, I was walking around the streets of Tokyo and saw the U.S. Embassy. And it has U.S. military guards there on the embassy grounds. And if you're an American citizen, you can show passport and enter. It's like having a little slice of your country in a foreign country. That way, expatriates, they call them sometimes, or expats, people who are living in another country working, like say you've got a job working in Japan, you would still have a place to connect legally with the United States because you would still be a U.S. citizen unless you changed your citizenship. But just because you live in a different country doesn't mean you change citizenship. Like, for instance, my brother, he lived over in Germany for 3 years. He was stationed there with the Air Force. So obviously he's still an American. He's just living in a different country and might have to work with the embassy if he has any issues, okay? There's also a word we use sometimes called a consulate, a small diplomatic office of one country in another. It's just like an embassy, but a smaller branch. Like a big country like China might have an embassy in Washington, D.C., and might have 10 consulates. They might have one in San Francisco and one in L.A. and one in Texas, and they might have one, in New York. I don't know how many they have. I'd have to Google it. But that's what a consulate is, like a small embassy. Okay? What is a civil society, and why do we want to have one? And again, we're kind of looking at bureaucracy and how bureaucracy helps things to function, because we can't switch out everybody's job in government when we have elections. Some people don't like the government, but life without a government would be frustrating. And you can look back in history when there were some times where there wasn't law and order, and it was bad. It was not good times. And so most of us want to know how government functions and what our role in it is, so that we can be good members of society. We're going to kind of close these notes up this week with some important vocabulary words on government. This is a word that people who teach politics and government throw out a lot. You'll hear it on the news if you're familiar with it. The word is sovereignty. And sovereignty is to have control over your own destiny. If you are a sovereign nation, that means you're an independent country. Okay, and that's what countries want, is to have sovereignty, to have the power and authority to govern a state or a nation. Countries want full sovereignty over their own territory and the ability to make their own laws. If a country doesn't feel like they have sovereignty, then they'll usually fight back. One example of the United States is back in we're talking late 1800s. Right at the turn of the century, when we're starting the 1900s, the United States actually started taking over other countries and putting them under our control. For instance, we took over a country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that lots of people call the Sandwich Islands. And we took the queen of those islands and kicked her out of office. And today we claim it as a part of our official country. It's called Hawaii. Now, if you know anybody who's like a native Hawaiian, they might have some issues with the U.S. government. Last time I was in Hawaii, I saw a lot of people driving around the streets, in their cars with a flag of Hawaii upside down, kind of saying that they were upset about how the U.S. government has just imposed itself on the islands of Hawaii. Some people think, well, Hawaii is a part of the United States, but that's not true. We took over Hawaii, forced the queen out of her own country, and seized it as a territory of the U.S., and then finally incorporated it as a state after World War II. Another example that's maybe even bigger is the Philippines. The Philippines are a chain of islands, an archipelago off the coast of Asia. Today it's an independent, sovereign nation. But if you were to go back into the early 1800s, it was a territory of the U.S. The United States controlled the Philippines, and the people in the Philippines didn't like that, and they resisted. And they used insurgency tactics to try to fight the United States off and kick us out. And it wasn't until after World War II where we gave sovereignty of the Philippines back to the people of the Philippines, the Filipinos. Okay, so sovereignty is a huge question. And it's been a huge debate in our country that we're going to deal with. How much sovereignty does a state have versus the entire federal government? So, in other words, every state in the United States has the ability to run some of its own laws and its own economy and tax its own citizens. But at the same time, we have the federal government that oversees the entire United States. And so that becomes a kind of a tricky thing called federalism that we'll deal with at a later time. But jurisdiction is a huge issue, and it's why we have to learn some geography in this class, because the government only has control around its political borders. So if you're a police officer, a sworn deputy of California, your jurisdiction ends at the border of California. So if somebody commits a crime in California and then crosses into another state, the police from one state generally cannot arrest or have no authority to arrest when they cross state boundaries because they end their jurisdiction. That's why the federal government instituted what they call the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where they have jurisdiction in the entire United States. They don't care about state boundaries. So that's why local police and the FBI sometimes butt heads because of jurisdictional boundaries. If somebody's killed in Apple Valley, it depends on who was killed, who does the arresting. If it deals with federal issues, the FBI might get involved. If it doesn't deal with federal issues, it might be just a local police investigation. Detectives from the local sheriff department get involved. But it all has to do with jurisdiction, the area where someone has official authority. As I just talked about, federalism is the sharing and dividing of power in the government between a central government, like in Washington, D.C., and its smaller parts, California, Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma. You get it, right? And even within states, we divide the power up into counties and municipalities, cities, towns, and those kind of things. And it has to do with sharing of power. We're going to do an entire lecture on federalism. I just want to introduce that topic because it is absolutely huge. The first time that I realized federalism is when I got my first real job in between my junior and senior year. A guy down the street owned a kill floor where he killed pigs and cattle and sheep, butchered them up. So that's what I did in between my junior and senior year. We'd kill pigs and cattle, and we'd make bacon, and we'd make ham, and we'd cut up roast beef and make beef jerky and all the kind of stuff. If you're a meat lover, that's the kind of stuff that I did. And it was really interesting working there, because when I got my paycheck from this first real job, of course, I had mowed lawns and had paper routes and all kinds of other jobs, worked on farms, hauling hay and milking cattle, and all kinds of stuff before I worked at this slaughterhouse. But when I got my first check, it was the first time I realized that there was two governments, because both of them took money out for taxes. The federal government took money out for taxes, and the state government took it out. And that's the first time I realized, whoa, there's two governments, and both of them are taking my money. And that's the first time where people really start to care and pay attention, when it hits your pocketbook. Okay? So, what are the limits of individual liberty? You might think that you have the freedom to do whatever you want, but if somebody else right next to you has the same freedom to do whatever they want, your two freedoms are going to intersect with each other. They're going to hit heads, because you're going to want to do something and somebody else is going to want to do something, and that's going to come into conflict. And that's, of course, why we have rules, and why we develop bureaucracies, and why we do those things and try to have a civil society. So what I'm going to do is end there and remind you that if you are not understanding everything that I'm lecturing on, I have provided crash course videos for you to look at, some which will be assigned in class. Thank you for being here. This is our Week 5 Notes, Fundamental Principles of Civil Society.